Hello, this is Crystal Stanich, and thank you for joining me for this week's First Chapter Friday. Today I will be reading from Neil Gaiman and Charles Vess's Stardust, being a romance within the realms of fairy. Hope you enjoy. Chapter 1, in which we learn of the village of Wall, and of the curious thing that occurs there every 9 years. There was once a young man who wished to gain his heart's desire. And while that is, as beginnings go, not entirely novel, for every tale about every young man there ever was or will be could start in a similar manner, there was much about this young man and what happened to him that was unusual, although even he never knew the whole of it. The tale started, as many tales have started, in Wall. The town of Wall stands today, as it has stood for 600 years, on a high jut of granite, amidst a small forest woodland. The houses of Wall are square and old, built of grey stone, with dark slate roofs and high chimneys, taking advantage of every inch of space on the rock. The houses lean into each other, are built one on the next, with here and there a bush or tree growing out of the side of a building. There is one road to Wall, a winding track rising sharply up from the forest, where it is lined with rocks and small stones. Followed far enough out of the forest, the track becomes a real road, paved with asphalt. Followed farther, the road gets larger. It is packed at all hours with cars and lorries rushing from city to city. Eventually, the road takes you to London, but London is a whole night's drive from Wall. The inhabitants of Wall are a taciturn breed, falling into two distinct types: the native Wall folk, as grey and tall and stocky as the granite outcrop their town was built upon, and the others, who have made Wall their home over the years, and their descendants. Below Wall, on the west, is the forest. To the south is a treacherously placid lake served by the streams that drop from the hills behind Wall. To the north, there are fields upon the hills, on which sheep graze. To the east is more woodland. Immediately to the east of Wall is a high grey rock wall, from which the town takes its name. The wall is old, built of rough, square lumps of hewn granite, and it comes from the woods and goes back to the woods once more. There is only one break in the wall, an opening about 6 feet in width, a little to the side of the village. Through the gap in the wall can be seen a large green meadow. Beyond the meadow, a stream, and beyond the stream there are trees. From time to time, shapes and figures can be seen amongst the trees in the distance. Huge shapes and odd shapes and small, glimmering things which flash and glitter and are gone. Even today, 2 townsmen stand on either side of the opening night and day, taking 8-hour shifts. They carry hefty wooden cudgels. They flank the opening on the town side. Their main function is to prevent the town's children from going through the opening, into the meadow and beyond. Occasionally they are called upon to discourage a solitary rambler, or one of the few visitors to the town, from going through the gateway. The children they discourage simply, with displays of the cudgel. Where ramblers and visitors are concerned, they are more inventive, only resorting to physical force as a last resort, if tales of new planted grass or a dangerous bull on the loose are not sufficient. Very rarely someone comes to Wall knowing what they are looking for, and these people they will sometimes allow through. There is a look in the eyes, and once seen it cannot be mistaken. The guard is relaxed once every 9 years, on May Day, when a fair comes to the meadow. The events that follow transpired many years ago. Queen Victoria was on the throne, but she was far from being the black-clad widow of Windsor. She had apples in her cheeks and the spring in her step, and Lord Melbourne often had cause to upbraid, gently, the young queen for her flightiness. She was, as yet, unmarried, although she was very much in love. Mr. Charles Dickens was serializing his novel Oliver Twist. Mr. Draper had just taken a photograph of the moon, freezing her pale face for the first time on cold paper. Mr. Morse had just announced a way of transmitting messages down metal wires. Had you mentioned magic or fairy to any of them, they would have smiled at you disdainfully, except perhaps for Mr. Dickens, at the time a young man, and beardless, and he would have looked at you wistfully. People were coming to the British Isles that spring. They came in ones, and they came in twos, and they landed at Dover, or in London, or in Liverpool, men and women with skins as pale as paper, skins as dark as volcanic rock, skins the color of cinnamon, speaking in a multitude of tongues. They came all through April, and they traveled by stream train, by hearse, by caravan or cart, and many of them walked. At that time, Dunstan Thorne was 18, and he was not a romantic. He had nut-brown hair and nut-brown eyes, and nut-brown freckles. He was middling tall, and slow of speech. He had an easy smile, which illuminated his face from within, and he dreamed, when he daydreamed in his father's meadow, of leaving the village of Wall and all its unpredictable charm, and going to London, or Edinburgh, or Dublin, or some great town where nothing was dependent on which way the wind was blowing. He worked on his father's farm and owned nothing, save a small cottage and a furrow field his parents had given him. Visitors were coming to Wall that April, and Dunstan resented them. Mr. Bromeo's inn, the Seventh Magpie, normally a warren of empty rooms, had filled a week earlier, and now the strangers had begun to take rooms in the farms and private houses, paying for their lodgings with strange coins, with herbs and spices, and even with gemstones. As the day of the fair approached, the atmosphere of anticipation mounted. People were waking earlier, counting days, counting minutes. The guards on the gate, at the sides of the wall, were restive and nervous. Figures and shadows moved in the trees at the edge of the meadow. In the Seventh Magpie, Bridget Comfrey, who was widely regarded as the most beautiful pot girl in living memory, was provoking friction between Tommy Forrester, whom she had been seen to step out with over the previous year, and a huge man with dark eyes and a small chittering monkey. The man spoke little English, but he smiled expressively whenever Bridget came by. In the pub's taproom, the regulars sat in awkward proximity to the visitors, speaking so. It's only every 9 years. They say in the old days it was every year, at midsummer. Ask Mr. Bromeos. He'll know. Mr. Bromeos was tall, and his skin was olive. His black hair was curled tightly on his head. His eyes were green. As the girls of the village became women, they took notice of Mr. Bromeos, but he did not return their notice. It was said he had come to the village quite some time ago, a visitor. But he had stayed in the village, and his wine was good, so the locals agreed. A loud argument broke out in the public lounge between Tommy Forrester and the dark-eyed man, whose name appeared to be Allen Bay. "Stop them! In the name of heaven, stop them!" shouted Bridget. "They're going out the back to fight over me." As she tossed her head, prettily, so that the light of the oil lamps caught her perfect golden curls. Nobody moved to stop the men, although a number of people, villagers and newcomers alike, went outside to speculate. Tommy Forrester removed his shirt and raised his fists in front of him. The stranger laughed and spat on the ground, and then he seized Tommy's right hand and sent him flying onto the ground, chin first. Tommy clambered to his feet and ran at the stranger. He landed a glancing blow on the man's cheek, before finding himself face down in the dirt, his face being slammed into the mud, with the wind knocked out of him. Alan Bay chuckled and said something in Arabic. That quickly, and that easily, the fight was over. Alan Bay climbed off Tommy Forrester, and he strutted over to Bridget Comfrey, bowed low to her, and grinned with gleaming teeth. Bridget ignored him and ran to Tommy. "Why, whatever has he done to you, my sweet?" she asked, and mopped the mud from his face with her apron, and called him all manner of endearments. Alan Bay went, with the spectators, back into the public rooms of the inn, and he graciously bought Tommy Forrester a bottle of Mr. Bermios's Chablis on his return. Neither of them was quite certain who had won, who had lost. Dunstan Thorne was not in the Seventh Magpie that evening. He was a practical lad, who had, for the last 6 months, been courting Daisy Hemstock, a young woman of similar practicality. They would walk, on fair evenings, around the village, and discuss the theory of crop rotation, and the weather, and other practical matters. And on these walks, upon which they were invariably accompanied by Daisy's mother and younger sister, walking a healthy 6 paces behind, they would, from time to time, stare at each other lovingly. At the door to the Hemstocks, Dunstan would pause, and bow, and take his farewell. And Daisy Hemstock would walk into her house, and remove her bonnet, and say, "I do so wish Mr. Thorne would make up his mind to propose. I am sure papa would not be averse to it." "Indeed, I am sure that he would not," said Daisy's mamma on this evening, as she said on every such evening, and she removed her own bonnet and her gloves, and led her daughters to the drawing-room, in which a very tall gentleman with a very long black beard was sitting, skirting through his pack. Daisy, and her mamma, and her sister, bobbed curtsies to the gentleman, who spoke little English, and had arrived a few days before. The temporary lodger, in his turn, stood and bowed to them. It was chilly that April, with the awkward changeability of English spring. The visitors came through the forest. They filled the spare rooms. They bunked out in cow byres and barns. Some of them raised colored tents. Some of them arrived in their own caravans, drawn by huge gray horses or by small shaggy ponies. In the forest there was a carpet of bluebells. On the morning of April the 29th, Dunstan Thorne grew guard duty on the gap in the wall with Tommy Forrester. They stood on each side of the wall, and they waited. Dunstan had done guard duties many times before, but hitherto his task had consisted of standing, and on occasion shooing away children. Today he felt important. He held a wooden cudgel, and as each stranger to the village came up to the break in the wall, Dunstan or Tommy would say, "Tomorrow, tomorrow. No one's coming through today, good sirs." And the strangers would retreat a little way, and stare through the break in the wall, at the unassuming meadow beyond it, at the unexceptional trees that dotted the meadow, at the rather dull forest behind it. Some of them attempted to strike up conversations with Dunstan or Tommy, but the young men, proud of their status as guards, declined to converse, contenting themselves by raising their heads, tightening their lips, and generally looking important. At lunchtime, Daisy Hempstock brought by a small pot of shepherd's pie for them both, and Bridget Comfrey brought them each a mug of spiced ale. And at twilight, another two able-bodied young men of the village arrived, carrying a lantern each, and Tommy and Dunstan walked down to the inn, where Mr. Bromios gave each of them a mug of his best ale, and his best ale was very fine indeed, as their reward for doing guard duty. There was a buzz of excitement in the inn, now crowded beyond believing. It was filled with visitors to the village from every nation in the world, or so it seemed to Dunstan, who had no sense of distance once you were beyond the woods that surrounded the village wall. So he regarded the tall gentleman in the black top hat at the table beside him, all the way from London, with as much awe as he regarded the taller ebony-colored gentleman in the white one-piece robe with whom he was dining. Dunstan knew that it was rude to stare, and that, as a villager of Wall, he had every right to feel superior to all of the foreigners. But he could smell unfamiliar spices on the air, and hear men and women speaking to each other in 100 tongues, and he gawked at them all unashamedly. And that is the beginning of chapter 1 of Neil Gaiman's Stardust. If you would like to know what happens next, please check out the book on Hoopla. Thank you and have a great day.